The French Revolution, Liberty and Terror. It began, as all storms do, with a whisper. Paris, 1789. The air is thick, not with smoke or rain, but with a kind of restless hunger. A hunger for bread, a hunger for justice, a hunger for change. France, the jewel of Europe, had become a paradox. Glittering at the top, starving at the bottom. The king still dined on silver plates, and the nobles powdered their wigs in a haze of perfume and privilege. But in the streets, beneath their balconies, something else was brewing. Something that even the smell of Versailles couldn't cover up. The common people, the Third Estate, were beginning to realize something rather inconvenient for the old order. That they vastly outnumbered everyone else. They were the farmers, the merchants, the laborers, the men and women who built France with their hands. And yet, in the great machinery of power, they were invisible. The clergy and the nobility, the First and Second Estates, enjoyed privilege, exemption, and untouchable luxury. The Third Estate paid the taxes, all of them. And it wasn't just taxes, it was humiliation, ritualized and ancient, the kind of daily degradation that seeps into the soul over generations. In the countryside, peasants worked land that they didn't own, paying feudal dues to lords who rarely even lived there. In the cities, workers toiled for scraps, while the price of bread climbed higher and higher. And in Paris, where the Enlightenment had lit 1,000 minds, those same ideas, liberty, equality, fraternity, began to feel less like philosophical toys and more like a roadmap. But to understand how the world came to the edge of such chaos, we need to step back for a moment, back into the glittering, crumbling world of Louis XVI. Imagine Versailles. Miles of polished marble, golden fountains, and mirrors that seem to stretch into eternity. The king, a shy, awkward man with kind eyes and a fondness for locks and keys, sits upon the most powerful throne in Europe. He doesn't want to be a tyrant. In fact, he's not sure he wants to rule at all. But history doesn't wait for comfort. Beside him is Marie Antoinette, the Austrian Archduchess turned French queen, the poster child of opulence, whether she wanted to be or not. To some, she was charming, radiant, a tragic romantic figure. To others, she was a foreign parasite, the symbol of everything that was wrong with France. And the people? They were beginning to starve. By 1788, France was broke, like catastrophically broke. Centuries of wars, reckless spending, and a particularly bad habit of helping the American colonies overthrow Britain. All had left the royal treasury bleeding, helping the Americans gain liberty while denying it at home. A touch of irony there. The economy collapsed like a deck of cards in a rainstorm. Poor harvests drove up food prices, and people began to riot over bread. Not luxury, not gold, bread, the very stuff of survival. Louis, in a rare moment of action, decided to summon the Estates General, a kind of parliament that hadn't met in over 170 years. That should tell you how bad things had become. Scene transition. Candlelight, the sound of murmuring voices. Versailles, May 1st, 1789. The Estates General gathers. Nobles in their finery, bishops in crimson robes, and the Third Estate in their plain black coats. It's a portrait of inequality, painted in silk and sorrow. The clergy and the nobility, of course, expected things to proceed as usual, two privileged orders outvoting the commoners. But the Third Estate had come with a different idea, that representation should be fair and that their votes actually matter. It sounds obvious now, but in that world, it was revolutionary. When the king ignored their pleas for reform, the delegates of the Third Estate decided they'd had enough. They left. They walked out of the gilded halls of Versailles, out into the summer air, and gathered in a nearby indoor tennis court. There, in that echoing hall, surrounded by peeling paint and the smell of sweat, they swore an oath, the tennis court oath, that they would not disband until France had a constitution. That moment, small and defiant, was the real beginning. For the first time, the people of France weren't just begging for change, they were declaring it. Louis didn't quite know what to do. He tried compromise, half measures, and polite commands, but the tide was already moving faster than he could comprehend. As the summer heated up, so did the streets. Paris, July 9th, 1789. The city is a cauldron. Rumors swirl like smoke, soldiers marching, gunpowder shortages, whispers of royal plots. The people are armed with pitchforks, clubs, whatever they can find. Then, on July 14th, they do the unthinkable. They march on the Bastille, a grim fortress prison that loomed over eastern Paris. More symbol than stronghold. It held only 7 prisoners that day, but it represented everything the people hated. Royal tyranny, arbitrary power, fear. The attack was chaotic, desperate, and bloody. Smoke filled the air, the crowd surged, and when the gates finally fell, they tore the place apart, stone by stone. The Bastille's fall wasn't just a victory, it was a declaration. The people of France were done asking politely.
Word spread like wildfire. Across the countryside, peasants revolted against their landlords. They burned manors, tore up records of feudal dues, and demanded their share of the nation they had built. It was chaos, yes, but it was also liberation. Back in Paris, the National Assembly, the rebranded Third Estate, began drafting a new constitution. In August, they unveiled one of the most important documents in modern history, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. It was bold, poetic, idealistic, and a little bit naive. All men are born free and equal in rights, it proclaimed. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, equality before the law. It was the Enlightenment made flesh, set to the rhythm of revolution. But liberty, as France would soon learn, is a tricky thing. Once you set it loose, it's very hard to control. As autumn turned to winter, the euphoria began to sour. The king hesitated, the nobles plotted, and the people grew impatient. The price of bread was still unbearable, and whispers filled the taverns and marketplaces. The king hoards grain. The queen mocks our hunger. She said, "Let them eat cake." She didn't, of course. She never said that, but history has a cruel sense of humor. In October 1789, thousands of women, market vendors, mothers, daughters, marched from Paris to Versailles in the rain. They carried knives, sticks, and muskets. They demanded bread, and they demanded the king's attention. When they reached the palace, they stormed the gates, screaming for justice. They found the queen's bedchamber, guards were killed, and by morning the royal family was escorted, not in a carriage of gold, but in a wagon surrounded by the people, back to Paris. The crowd shouted, "We have the baker, the baker's wife, and the baker's boy." They weren't being poetic. They meant it literally. The people believed they had brought their bread makers home. It was the end of Versailles as a royal court. The monarchy, once divine and untouchable, was now captive in its own capital. The revolution was no longer an idea. It was alive, unpredictable, hungry, and unstoppable. But beneath the cheers, beneath the songs of liberty, something darker stirred. Old institutions were collapsing, but new ones had not yet formed. Hope was turning into suspicion, and as the first blood dried on the cobblestones of Paris, one couldn't help but wonder, quietly, uneasily, had France just liberated itself, or unleashed something far worse?
The fall of the monarchy. Revolutions are strange creatures. They begin in poetry, in oaths, declarations, and noble ideals, and then somehow find their way into the mud. By 1790, France was still celebrating. The king had accepted the Declaration of the Rights of Man, or so it seemed. The Bastille had fallen. Feudalism, that ancient web of dues and privileges, had been officially abolished, and Paris, for a moment, believed it had won. There was even a festival, the Fête de la Fédération, held on the Champ de Mars. Imagine it. July sunlight pouring over a field of tricolor flags, people embracing, soldiers swearing loyalty to the new constitution, and the king, yes, even Louis XVI, taking a solemn oath to uphold the revolution. The people cheered him. The drums rolled. The banners waved. And for a brief, trembling moment, France felt whole again. But revolutions are like volcanoes. Even when they appear quiet, something is always rumbling beneath the surface. The National Assembly, made up largely of middle-class lawyers, merchants, and intellectuals, now faced an impossible task: to rebuild an entire nation while keeping it from tearing itself apart. They dreamed of a constitutional monarchy, a balanced system where the king would remain head of state, but under the guidance of a written constitution and the will of the people. Louis XVI, however, had other plans, or rather, no plan at all. He played the part of the constitutional king, but behind the walls of the Tuileries Palace, he was quietly plotting his escape. He hated his captivity. He hated the mobs, and perhaps deep down, he hated himself for being so weak in the face of history. Marie Antoinette, ever the symbol of foreignness and extravagance, urged him to flee. Her letters to her brother, Emperor Leopold II of Austria, pleaded for help. By June 1791, the royal family decided they'd had enough of this liberty business. The sound of hooves at midnight. A disguised carriage creaks out of Paris. The king dressed as a servant, the queen in peasant clothes. They make for the northeastern border, hoping to reach the loyal fortress of Montmendy. But Louis, bless him, wasn't exactly made for espionage. He was recognized, by a postmaster of all people, in the small town of Varennes. The royal family was stopped, arrested, and escorted back to Paris under armed guard. The crowd was silent as they entered the city. No cheers, no chants, just cold, disbelieving stares. The King of France had tried to abandon his people. It was the final betrayal. The revolution hardened. The mood shifted from reform to survival. Where once the king had been Louis the restorer of liberty, he was now Louis the traitor. The flight to Varennes shattered any illusion that monarchy and revolution could coexist. Radical voices grew louder. One of them was Maximilien Robespierre, a quiet lawyer from Arras with a sharp mind and a chilling clarity of purpose. He believed in the purity of the revolution, that virtue must guide it, and corruption must be cut away like disease. He was not a man of compromise, and compromise was dying in Paris. Outside the assembly, new clubs and societies sprang up like mushrooms after rain, each with its own flavor of passion and paranoia. The Jacobins, meeting in a former Dominican monastery, became the beating heart of radical thought. Across from them, the Girondins, more moderate, more provincial, preached reason and order. It was democracy's first great family feud. And as with all family feuds, it would end in blood. Meanwhile, Europe watched with fascination and fear. Kings and emperors saw what was happening in France, a people rising against their rulers, and they didn't like the idea one bit. In Vienna and Berlin, courts whispered, armies prepared. The message was clear. If France's king could fall, what ruler was safe? The revolution was no longer just a French affair. It was contagious. Inside France, food was still scarce, the economy was collapsing, and the army was restless. Desperate for unity, the new legislative assembly decided that war might solve everything. You know, as if that had ever worked before. In April 1792, France declared war on Austria. It was, in hindsight, a spectacularly bad idea. The French army, poorly trained, poorly supplied, and commanded by nobles who didn't trust the revolution, stumbled into disaster. Defeats piled up. Rumors of treason spread like wildfire. People began to whisper that the king was secretly helping the enemy, and for once, the rumors weren't entirely wrong. In the summer of 1792, the situation reached a breaking point. Foreign armies advanced on Paris. The Brunswick Manifesto, issued by the Prussian Duke of Brunswick, warned that if the royal family were harmed, Paris would be destroyed. That was not the reassurance anyone needed. The city erupted. On August 10, 1792, the people of Paris, led by the Revolutionary Commune, stormed the Tuileries Palace. It was chaos. Cannon fire, screams, smoke. The Swiss guards loyal to the king were massacred. Hundreds cut down in the bloodiest day Paris had ever seen. Louis and his family fled for protection to the Legislative Assembly itself. The monarchy was finished. The assembly suspended the king and declared the birth of the French Republic. The streets roared with triumph. Liberty had finally defeated tyranny, or so they believed. But in truth, France had just crossed a line it could never step back from. Outside Paris, the war went terribly. Inside Paris, paranoia reigned. In September 1792, as enemy armies approached the capital, the fear of royalist plots reached hysteria. Mobs stormed the prisons, dragging out nobles, priests, and anyone accused of treachery. They didn't bother with trials. For days, the city ran red. This was the September Massacres, a name too clean for what it really was. Thousands were killed in cold blood, their bodies dumped in the streets, their deaths cheered as acts of patriotism. The revolution had devoured its first victims. And yet, amidst the horror, something else was born. The Republic, baptized in blood, began to take shape. The National Convention replaced the Assembly. New leaders rose, men like Danton, loud and passionate, and Marat, the half-mad journalist who saw enemies everywhere. They called themselves the Mountain because they sat high up in the Assembly Hall, and they believed that only through terror could liberty survive. And sitting quietly among them, watching, thinking, was Robespierre. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply believed, with an almost sacred conviction, that the revolution was pure, and that purity must be defended at any cost. That conviction would soon turn into something very, very dangerous. Meanwhile, the king, that awkward, indecisive man who once ruled by divine right, sat in a prison cell. He read, prayed, and waited. He was no longer His Majesty, he was Citizen Capet. The convention debated his fate. Some wanted mercy, others demanded justice. In the end, justice won, or at least their version of it did. Scene: a gray January morning, 1793. Cold wind over the Place de la Révolution. A wooden scaffold rises. A blade gleams. Louis XVI, pale and trembling, climbs the steps. He tries to speak, but the drums drown his voice. The executioner does his work swiftly. The blade falls. The crowd roars. The King of France is dead. The monarchy that had stood for nearly 1,000 years is gone. And in its place stands a republic, radical, righteous, and ready to cleanse the world of tyranny. But revolutions, once they start cutting, rarely know when to stop. The Republic and the Guillotine. The king is dead, and with his death, a silence falls over Europe, the kind of silence that comes just before the thunder. The execution of Louis XVI in January 1793 was not just the death of a man, it was the death of a world. Every monarch in Europe felt the blow, and every revolutionary in France felt its echo, half in triumph, half in dread. Because now there was no turning back. France was officially a republic. But what kind of republic exactly? No one seemed to know. The National Convention, now the ruling body, was split down the middle. On one side stood the Girondins, educated, idealistic, and cautious. They dreamed of liberty with law, of reason over vengeance. On the other side were the Jacobins, led by Robespierre and Danton, fiery, uncompromising, and convinced that the revolution had to be defended at any cost. Between them stood chaos. Outside the walls of Paris, the situation was catastrophic. The European monarchies, Austria, Prussia, Britain, Spain, all declared war on France. The War of the First Coalition had begun, and France was losing. Armies defected, towns rebelled. In the western countryside, the Vendée rose up in royalist revolt, peasants fighting for their priests, their faith, and their king, even if he was already dead. The revolution that promised liberty was suddenly surrounded by enemies on every side, both foreign and domestic. And when a revolution feels cornered, it starts to bite. Paris became a city of suspicion. Every face was a question mark, every whisper a potential conspiracy. Food was scarce, inflation soared, the assignée, France's revolutionary currency, was worth little more than paper. And all the while, the convention argued, endlessly, violently, about what to do. The Girondins called for moderation. The Jacobins called them traitors. In June 1793, the radicals made their move. Crowds, stirred by the Paris Commune and its revolutionary clubs, stormed the convention and demanded the arrest of the Girondin deputies. The moderates were purged, imprisoned, and soon executed. The revolution, once made in the name of the people, was now ruled by fear of the people. Out of this chaos emerged the Committee of Public Safety, an ironically named body of 12 men given near dictatorial power to save the Republic. It was meant to be temporary. It became the beating heart of terror. Its members included Georges Danton, a man of thunderous voice and rough charisma, and Maximilien Robespierre, the incorruptible, a man so devoted to virtue that he saw compromise as sin. Around them gathered others, Couthon, Saint-Just, Carnot, names that would soon be whispered with awe and horror alike. Their mission was simple: to defend the revolution by any means necessary. And they meant any. The guillotine, that national razor, became the symbol of France's new order. It had been introduced as a humane invention, an enlightened way to execute swiftly and without pain. Dr. Guillotine himself had proposed it as a more civilized alternative to hanging or torture. But there's something about a machine designed for efficient death. It has a way of getting used. And used it was. At first, the guillotine stood as a warning, a promise that treason would not be tolerated. But soon, it became routine. Each morning, the carts rolled through Paris, carrying prisoners to the Place de Révolution. Nobles, priests, soldiers, merchants, even former revolutionaries, all equal beneath the blade. In that strange, mechanical equality, France found its most chilling truth. Liberty had become an executioner. Meanwhile, inside the committee, Robespierre began to see himself as something more than a politician, almost a priest of a new faith. He spoke not of parties or factions, but of virtue and corruption, of republican morality and public virtue. He declared that terror was merely justice, prompt, severe, and inflexible. And as if to test this theory, Paris soon found itself knee-deep in blood. Spring 1793. The revolution devoured its own children. Old allies turned on each other. Danton and Robespierre, once inseparable, began to drift apart. Danton called for mercy, for an end to the endless executions. Robespierre saw that as weakness. And, in the logic of revolution, weakness is treason. Soon, Danton himself would stand on the scaffold, his booming voice silenced by the blade he once defended. But that comes later. For now, the terror tightens its grip.
The Revolutionary Tribunal, a court created to try enemies of the people, became a theater of death. Trials were swift, evidence optional, defense discouraged. The verdict was almost always the same: guilty. The accused were paraded before the crowds, their names read aloud like a litany, and every fall of the blade was met with cheers, or perhaps nervous relief from those still alive. The terror wasn't confined to Paris. Across the provinces, representatives on mission spread the revolution's justice. In Lyon, rebellious citizens were lined up in rows and executed by cannon fire. In Nantes, prisoners were drowned by the hundreds in what one official called Republican baptisms. The Loire River ran red. In Paris, propaganda painted all this as necessary. The Republic, they said, was like a tree, and sometimes to make it grow, one must water it with the blood of tyrants. The problem was, the definition of tyrant kept expanding. It included aristocrats, then priests, then merchants, then anyone who frowned at the wrong time. Soon, simply being moderate was a crime. And all the while, Robespierre stood in the convention, calm, eloquent, terrifyingly sincere. He didn't shout. He didn't rage. He simply declared that virtue required terror, and the crowd applauded. But even in this nightmare, there were moments of strange human absurdity. In 1793, the radicals decided that Christianity was too old-fashioned. They closed the churches, melted down the bells, and replaced the old faith with a new one, the cult of reason. There were festivals, people dancing around statues of liberty, parading in togas, proclaiming reason as their goddess. And then Robespierre, ever the moralist, decided that this new cult was too chaotic, too atheistic, too hedonistic. So he invented another one, the cult of the Supreme Being. In the summer of 1794, he led a grand festival himself, dressed in a sky blue coat, marching before an enormous papier-mâché mountain. He spoke of virtue, purity, and divine justice. It was beautiful. It was absurd. It was terrifying. Because by then, everyone knew that disagreeing with Robespierre's definition of virtue was a death sentence. Meanwhile, the war still raged, but now, miraculously, France was winning. Its armies, fired by revolutionary zeal and commanded by new generals, men like Napoleon Bonaparte, began pushing back the invading forces. The Republic no longer teetered on the brink. It stood tall, victorious, and, ironically, more secure than ever. But the guillotine kept falling. By the summer of 1794, paranoia reached its peak. Robespierre saw enemies everywhere, in the convention, in the army, even within the committee itself. No one was safe. He began ordering the arrests of fellow revolutionaries, men who had stood beside him since the beginning. He had become what he once fought against, a ruler who trusted no one, who silenced opposition with death. And in the end, as always, fear turned inward. The men of the convention began to whisper,
If Robespierre could kill anyone, then who was next? The answer came on a sweltering July day, 9 Thermidor, year 2 by the new revolutionary calendar. Robespierre rose to speak, vague and ominous as ever. He accused unnamed enemies of plotting against the Republic. It was a speech too far. The convention turned on him. The incorruptible had finally become intolerable. That night, he was arrested, along with his closest allies. There was a brief struggle, a gunshot, chaos in the Hôtel de Ville. By morning, Robespierre lay broken-jawed, pale, and silent, awaiting his own judgment. Scene: July 28th, 1794. A hot afternoon. The guillotine once again waits in the square. Robespierre is carried to the scaffold. He says nothing. The blade falls. The crowd cheers, louder than they had in months. The terror, it seemed, had finally devoured itself. But the echo of that blade, that steady rhythm of execution, would haunt France for generations. The revolution had promised liberty. It had delivered blood. And yet, somehow, out of that blood, the modern world was being born. The old order was gone. The idea that kings ruled by divine right was shattered forever. And in its place, something new and dangerous had emerged. The idea that power belonged to the people. A beautiful dream, a terrible weapon, sometimes both at once. The Reign of Terror. By the summer of 1793, the revolution had entered a new phase, darker, faster, unstoppable. Gone were the days of hopeful slogans and parchment declarations. The air of Paris no longer smelled of ink and enlightenment. It smelled of sweat, fear, and the faint tang of blood drying on wood. The Reign of Terror had begun. Of course, they didn't call it that at the time. They called it justice. They called it virtue. They called it necessary. But history, ever honest in hindsight, calls it what it was: a nightmare dressed in patriotism. France in 1793 was surrounded by enemies. British fleets blockaded the ports. Austrian and Prussian armies pressed from the north. The Vendée burned with rebellion. And inside Paris, the revolution itself was tearing at its seams. The National Convention, desperate to keep control, granted the Committee of Public Safety extraordinary powers, essentially the right to rule by decree. It was, ironically, the most concentrated form of power France had ever seen, all in the name of liberty. The committee moved swiftly. They instituted universal conscription, every able-bodied man to defend the Republic, every woman to produce supplies, every child to learn the virtues of freedom. It was called the Levée en masse, the mass rising, and it transformed France into a collapsing state, into a war machine. For the first time, the nation itself was at war, not just its king. That idea that a people could rise to defend their own revolution would echo for centuries. But so would its cost. Inside Paris, the Revolutionary Tribunal went into overdrive. Trials were short, sentences swift. If the accused denied guilt, that was proof enough. If they wept, it was treachery. If they stayed calm, it was insolence. A man could be condemned for sighing during a patriotic speech. The tribunal's judges worked tirelessly, turning justice into something mechanical, efficient, bloodless in its logic, but very bloody in its outcome. Every day, the guillotine rose and fell in the Place de la Révolution. The crowd gathered early, vendors selling pastries and pamphlets, children perched on their fathers' shoulders. It had become a kind of theater. Death, now, was public entertainment, and it had a schedule. The numbers tell one story, perhaps 15,000 executed, maybe more. But the feeling tells another. The sense that death was everywhere, that one's own shadow might be accused of treason by morning, the sound of boots outside your door at midnight, the sealed envelopes, the hush of neighbors who no longer made eye contact. This was not just physical terror, it was spiritual exhaustion. The revolution had promised to free men from fear, and instead, it had perfected it. The committee enforced new laws with merciless precision.
The law of suspects made almost anyone guilty. Enemies of the people now included former nobles, priests, merchants, or even citizens insufficiently enthusiastic about the revolution. They said indifference is treason. People denounced each other out of fear or jealousy, or simply to survive another day. Whole families disappeared overnight. And through it all, Robespierre stood unbending, certain that history itself was on his side. He believed that terror and virtue were twin guardians of the Republic, one cleansing corruption, the other ensuring purity. He said, "Virtue without terror is powerless, and terror without virtue is fatal." He meant it. To the revolutionaries, this was the price of salvation. To the victims, it was madness. The prisons overflowed with the condemned. The carts rattled daily to the scaffold. The pumbrils, they were called. Those rickety wooden wagons carrying the accused to their final audience. People began to recognize them by sound alone. The rhythmic creak of wheels, the distant roll of drums. You could tell the time of day by the guillotine. And then in October 1793, the revolution's most famous prisoner mounted the scaffold. Marie Antoinette, the last queen of France, pale, thin, her hair cut short. Once accused of every sin imaginable, from extravagance to incest, she now seemed less like a villain and more like a ghost. As she approached the executioner, she accidentally stepped on his foot and murmured, "Pardon me, sir, I did not mean to." Those were her last words. The blade fell, and the crowd cheered. The queen was dead. But the cheers sounded.
Her death didn't stop the terror. It only fueled it. The revolution had cut off the head of monarchy, but found it still hungry. Now it turned inward. In December, the Girondins, the moderates, were executed. Then the royalists. Then the clergy. Then the revolutionaries who had once shouted liberty the loudest. Even Danton, who had once said, "Let us be terrible so the people need not be," was accused of corruption and sent to the blade. On his way to the scaffold, he laughed bitterly and said, "My only regret is that I'm going before that rat, Robespierre." The crowd roared with laughter. Then the drums rolled and the laughter stopped. Each execution, each speech, each decree made the revolution purer and emptier. Robespierre spoke often now of virtue, of morality, of the republic of the good. He banned taverns, gambling, and prostitution. He declared that the republic must be a temple of civic religion. He was building not a democracy, but a theology, with himself as its high priest. And like all high priests, he began to see heresy everywhere. In June 1794, the law of 22 Prairial gave the Revolutionary Tribunal absolute power. No defense counsel, no witnesses, only two verdicts, acquittal or death. Guess which one was more popular? The guillotine became insatiable. Whole batches of prisoners were executed together, dozens at a time. The people began to whisper that the blade itself had grown tired, that it groaned under the weight of so many heads. Paris stank of death and summer heat. Even the most loyal patriots began to wonder in the dark if perhaps they had gone too far. And still Robespierre spoke. He spoke of the Supreme Being, of a France reborn through virtue. On June 8, 1794, he organized the Grand Festival of the Supreme Being, a vast celebration meant to unite the people under this new moral order. Imagine it, Robespierre in a sky-blue coat, walking before an artificial mountain in the Champ de Mars. He carried flowers and sang hymns to reason, to nature, to the Republic. Behind him, the people chanted his name. Some admired him, others began to fear him. He had become too perfect, too pure, and purity is a terrifying thing when it holds a sword. In the weeks that followed, his paranoia deepened. He accused his fellow revolutionaries, men who had shared his battles, his dreams, of corruption, conspiracy, betrayal. They whispered in return. They plotted in corners. And then one night in July, the whispers became shouts. On 9 Thermidor, Year 2, July 27, 1794, Robespierre rose in the convention to deliver another speech. He accused his enemies of treason, but didn't name them. It was a fatal mistake. Everyone assumed he meant them. Within hours, the chamber turned against him. The incorruptible was shouted down, arrested, and taken to the same prison where he had sent so many before. That night, chaos ruled Paris. His supporters tried to free him. Gunfire echoed through the Hôtel de Ville. Some say Robespierre shot himself. Others say he was shot by a soldier. Either way, by morning, his jaw was shattered, and his voice, the one that had once commanded a nation, could only groan. Reseen, July 28, 1794, the Place de la Révolution once again waits, hot under the summer sun. The crowd gathers, the drums beat. Robespierre is carried to the scaffold, bloodied and broken, alongside his closest allies. No speeches now, no sermons about virtue. The blade falls, the crowd erupts, not in fear, not in sorrow, but in wild, giddy relief. It is said that when his head dropped, the sound was like a thunderclap. Not because of the blade, but because the city exhaled. The terror was over. At least the official one. In the weeks that followed, France staggered in disbelief. The prisons emptied, the executions slowed. The same crowds who had once chanted for blood now wanted peace, or at least silence. The revolution had devoured its priests, its kings, its prophets, and its monsters. And what remained was exhaustion. The dream of perfect liberty had drowned in fear. But from that wreckage, something unkillable had survived. The idea that power could belong to the people, that kings were not gods, and that freedom, however fragile, was worth bleeding for.
The end of the revolution. After the fall of Robespierre, France woke up as if from a nightmare. A hot July morning in 1794, the sky above Paris was cloudless, the streets thick with dust, and for the first time in months, no guillotine thundered in the square. The blade that had once been raised in the name of liberty now sat still, its wood stained and cracking under the summer sun. It was over, at least the worst of it. The reign of terror had ended with the same speed and violence that had birthed it. But the revolution itself, it wasn't dead. It was simply lost. France at that moment was a country in ruins, physically, politically, emotionally. The wars still raged across Europe. The economy was shattered. Inflation was so high that a loaf of bread cost a week's wages. The streets were full of veterans, missing limbs, and beggars clutching their last scraps of assignats, the paper money that was worthless than the paper it was printed on. The people were exhausted. They had shouted for liberty, fought for equality, and bled for fraternity, and found themselves surrounded by empty chairs and silent tables. The Thermidorian reaction, as historians would later call it, was less a revolution than a sigh. The radicals were gone, the guillotine silenced. The survivors of the convention moved quickly to distance themselves from the terror, to erase their own complicity in it. Speeches that had once praised Robespierre were suddenly edited, censored, or burned. Statues were toppled, portraits disappeared overnight. In Paris, you could measure a man's fear by how quickly he painted over his own slogans. The new leaders, men like Barras, Carnot, and Tallien, promised moderation, calm, and a return to normal life. But no one really knew what normal meant anymore.
In the months that followed, the revolution tried to reinvent itself yet again. Gone was the Committee of Public Safety, gone were the tribunals and the parades of the condemned. In their place came a new constitution, the Constitution of Year 3, approved in 1795. It created the Directory, a 5-man executive council that was supposed to prevent tyranny by dividing power among equals. Of course, dividing power among politicians in a collapsing state has never gone wrong in history. Ever. The Directory, as it turned out, was many things: pragmatic, corrupt, indecisive, and endlessly quarrelsome, but it was not strong. Still, for a brief moment, France exhaled. People returned to the theaters, cafes reopened. The once feared revolutionary calendar, with its new months like Thermidor and Fructidor, became more of a joke than a creed. Women wore extravagant dresses again, ironically called robes à la victime, cut to resemble the gowns worn by those who went to the guillotine. Society, in its strange Parisian way, turned even terror into fashion. But beneath the glitter, the cracks were showing. The army was the only institution still functioning, and it was increasingly loyal to itself rather than the government. The Directory owed its survival not to popular support, but to the generals who kept the mobs and the monarchists at bay. And among those generals, one name began to stand out. A thin, sharp-featured Corsican, quiet and intense, who wrote long letters about destiny and power. Napoleon Bonaparte. At first, he was just another officer, but in October 1795, when royalist insurgents rose up against the Directory, it was Napoleon who crushed them, with what he later called a whiff of grape shot. The phrase became legend. He had saved the Republic, or at least the men who ran it, by turning his cannons on his own city. It was a cold, decisive act, and France, weary of chaos, admired it. The revolution had devoured so many talkers. At last, here was one who did something.
The Directory's years, 1795 to 1799, were years of uneasy peace, punctuated by war abroad and corruption at home. France was still fighting Britain, Austria, and Prussia, but now under the banners of republican virtue rather than survival. The army swept through Italy, the Low Countries, the Rhine, spreading liberty at the point of a bayonet. But at home, the ideals of 1789, liberty, equality, fraternity, had begun to feel like relics of a dream. The poor were still poor, the rich were still rich, just different people now. And the revolution's promise of moral renewal had curdled into something pragmatic, cynical, and tired. People wanted peace, and perhaps someone strong enough to enforce it. That someone was waiting in the wings. In 1796, Napoleon, now commanding the army of Italy, began a lightning campaign against Austria. In a matter of months, he transformed from an obscure general into a national hero. His dispatches were poetic, his victories cinematic. He promised his soldiers honor, glory, and riches. He promised France salvation through strength. And for a people exhausted by speeches, that sounded refreshingly clear. He returned from Italy a conqueror, and when the Directory sent him to Egypt in 1798 to distract him, well, let's just say he took the hint, but not the message. Egypt was exotic, dangerous, and ultimately a military failure, but Napoleon spun it into legend. He brought back not only stories of pyramids and sphinxes, but the mystique of destiny itself. By 1799, the Directory was collapsing. France was broke. The war is dragging on. The government paralyzed by infighting. The people once again began to murmur the forbidden question: had liberty gone too far? And that's when Napoleon returned. He landed in southern France, quietly, confidently, like a man coming home to collect what was already his. He moved swiftly to Paris, gathered allies in the army, and began to speak of saving the Republic from itself. The coup came on 18 Brumaire, year 8, November 9th, 1799. Inside the halls of power, amid shouting, confusion, and fainting deputies, Napoleon seized control. He declared the end of the Directory. The revolution, the one that had begun with a crowd storming the Bastille 10 years earlier, ended with one man calmly taking the reins. No mobs, no banners, no speeches about the rights of man, just a signature and a silence. The French Revolution was over. In its place stood a new regime, the Consulate, with Napoleon as first consul. The words had changed, the spirit had not. Power was still absolute, only now it wore a different uniform. And in that silence, as the streets of Paris filled once again with soldiers and flags, France began to drift not back toward monarchy, nor forward into utopia, but sideways into something new. An empire of order, an empire of ambition, an empire born from the ruins of liberty. The world would remember the revolution for its ideals, but also for its contradictions. It destroyed tyranny only to invent its own. It preached equality while guillotining dissent. It promised peace and delivered perpetual war. But beneath all the blood and confusion, something profound had shifted. For the first time in modern history, the people of a nation had claimed the right to change their destiny, not by divine permission, but by their own will. Kings would never sleep soundly again. The revolution ended not with fireworks, but with fatigue. The guillotine rusted, the crowds dispersed, and a soldier in a gray coat began to dream of crowns. The experiment of liberty had survived its own chaos, and in doing so had become a warning and a beacon both. Because freedom, once imagined, never fully dies. It waits, quietly, for its next chance.
Legacy and reflection. The French Revolution is over. The crowds are gone, the guillotine stands silent, and the ideals that once burned so brightly now flicker like embers in the ashes. Yet somehow, the fire still glows. It is easy, centuries later, to see the French Revolution as a grand narrative, a simple story of liberty triumphing over tyranny, or of madness devouring reason. But the truth, as always, is quieter, more human, more sleepless. Because revolutions are not born in parliaments or battlefields. They begin in hearts, in the quiet discontent of people who one day decide that enough has finally arrived. France in 1789 was not a monster waiting to awaken. It was a country full of hope, of writers and peasants, soldiers and mothers, all imagining that maybe, for the first time, the world could be fair. And for a moment, just a brief shining moment, it was. The Declaration of the Rights of Man, the fall of the Bastille, the abolition of feudal privileges, these were not illusions. They were real. They mattered. For the first time, the old order trembled, and for the first time, the common man stood tall. But revolutions, like stars, burn hottest before they collapse. The same fire that lights the world can consume it. And in that fire, in the chaos of fear, war, and paranoia, liberty can become indistinguishable from terror. When Robespierre spoke of virtue, he believed it. When the crowds cheered the guillotine, they believed it too. Each, in their own way, thought they were building a better world. And that may be the cruelest truth of all, that horror so often comes wrapped in the conviction of righteousness. Yet through the noise and the blood, something permanent emerged. The French Revolution reshaped not just France, but the entire modern world. Its echoes rang through Europe, across oceans, into the very foundations of how we think about power and justice. The idea that governments exist to serve the people, not the other way around, became impossible to silence. That kings could fall, that priests could be questioned, that citizens could rule themselves, this was the revolution's true victory. Even those who feared it could not unlearn it. When Napoleon rose from its ashes, he carried those ideas with him, though in a form far more disciplined and far less idealistic. He conquered half of Europe, yes, but he also spread the laws of 1789. Equality before the law, merit over birth, the end of serfdom. In that sense, even empire became a vehicle for revolution. History, it seems, loves irony.
But the deeper legacy of the French Revolution lies not in what it achieved, but in what it revealed. It showed that human beings, when desperate enough, can overthrow the world that binds them. But it also showed that power, any power, no matter how noble in its birth, carries within it the seed of corruption. The revolution promised freedom and delivered fear. It promised equality and found itself ruled by generals. It promised reason and drowned in passion. And yet, we still speak of it with awe. Because despite everything, the madness, the terror, the contradictions, the revolution never stopped reaching for something sacred, the belief that humanity could be better. Even now, when we speak of rights, of democracy, of the people's voice, we are whispering the language of 1789. It flows quietly beneath every constitution, every protest, every whispered act of defiance. Liberty, equality, fraternity, 3 words written in blood and hope, still hang in the air like a prayer. Sometimes, late at night, I imagine the ghosts of that age, the peasants of the countryside, the women who marched on Versailles, the men who debated in candlelit halls, their voices rising over the crackle of fire and the murmur of fear. I imagine them asking us what became of their dream. Would they recognize us? Would they be proud? Or would they shake their heads, the way history so often does, and whisper, "You learned nothing"? Maybe both. Because revolutions never really end. They change shape. They sleep and then awaken under different flags in different languages with different faces. Sometimes they march with banners. Sometimes they whisper in classrooms or courtrooms or city squares. Sometimes they just live quietly in the human heart, that stubborn spark that insists we can do better. The French Revolution did not destroy tyranny once and for all. It merely proved that tyranny is mortal. And perhaps that is enough, because for every Robespierre and Napoleon, there will always be another voice, somewhere, daring to imagine liberty again. And so the story ends, not with a bang, not with a cheer, but with a whisper. The whisper of a people who, for all their flaws and failures, dared to believe that freedom was possible, and by believing it, made it real. Liberty is not a gift, it is a wound and the courage to live with it.